This program is recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television.
Welcome to From the Newsroom, a production of the Western Wisconsin Press Club in cooperation with Chippewa Valley Community TV. I'm Henry Lippold, Professor Emeritus of Communications and Journalism at the UWEC and a member of the Press Club. Well, today we'll look at an organization that is in the news rather sporadically, but the United Nations. And we're happy to have with us an expert on that subject, UW-Eau Political Science Professor Stephen Hill. He teaches peacekeeping and conflict resolution, among other subjects. And it's been some years since you've been here.
It is. I think it's about 12 years.
Well,
It's flown by.
Well, we are very happy to have you back again.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I noticed that the UN just had a birthday.
Yes.
June 26, 1945, the UN Charter was signed in San Francisco, so it's 71 years old.
Mm-hmm.
What did the signers at the UN gathering hope to accomplish?
Well, I think the main goal was to prevent the atrocities and the terrible effects of the war that they just witnessed. So I think as all generals do, you try to fight the old wars, prevent the old wars from happening, and the United Nations founding states did the same thing in San Francisco. They designed an organization that was primarily designed to protect the sovereignty of states so that it would prevent obviously despots like Hitler and Mussolini and others from attacking other states. So the goal was, if we want to prevent another world war, we need to protect the sovereignty of states and prevent others from acting in an aggressive way. So I think you can understand why they designed it as they did, and that was the goal. But of course what we've seen over the last 60 or 70 years is a transition to a situation in which most of the conflict that we're seeing is occurring not between states but within states. And the UN Security Council and the United Nations wasn't designed really to deal with conflicts within states. It was designed to try to prevent conflict between them. So we're dealing with the need to reform an organization over the last 20, 30 years, and the need to reform the organization to make it more effective in dealing with crises that are occurring within states.
Would you say it's been successful?
I would personally. I think if you read the literature around peacekeeping, around the United Nations, there are a lot of success stories. Joshua Goldstein, who's a professor at American University, wrote a book in 2012 called Winning the War on War, and he really, in that text, documents how conflict has decreased significantly since 1945. In fact, some scholars, John Mueller at Ohio University, has even talked about the obsolescence of interstate war, that we're at a point now where we hardly ever see wars between states. But we do see wars within states, civil wars, but those civil wars are decreasing in number too, and the number of people who are dying in them is decreasing. And Joshua Goldstein, and I agree with his analysis, argues that a lot of the cause of that decrease is because we've become better at dealing with these crises. So the United Nations has developed its peacekeeping operations and its capabilities. Peacekeeping as a term doesn't exist in the UN Charter. So the Founding Fathers never envisaged in 1945 that they would be conducting UN peacekeeping operations. But since 1945, we've conducted about 70 of them altogether. There are 16 operations ongoing this year, with over 100,000 troops involved in them. And many of them have ended in success, where we've transitioned states from severe conflict into at least giving them a semblance, a start with a new life and a peaceful life. And the reason we were able to do that is we've spent a lot of time thinking and working on the question of how best to provide the opportunity for stability in these situations. So a lot of UN diplomats, a lot of volunteers, a lot of peacekeepers, a lot of academics involved in questions of conflict resolution, how to construct peace agreements, for example, when to use peacekeepers and what type of peacekeepers. So all of that work over the last 70 years, I think, has emerged because of the need that the founders never really envisaged back in 1945. But in general, I think the decline in conflict is because we've learned how to deal with it better than we did before.
Could you name a couple of countries where there was success?
Yes, of course. Well, to go back to the early 2000s, there are places, for example, like Angola and Mozambique. We have places like Sierra Leone and Liberia that have become examples of relative success in peacekeeping operations. And I mean, just of the operations that are ongoing at the moment, one of the largest ever conducted is being conducted in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think one of the big questions is, how do you define success? Because if you set the bar too high, if success becomes creating a peaceful environment where everybody's happy and there's no conflict whatsoever, you then end up creating the bar that's so difficult to meet, you're always in failure. But if you look at the peacekeeping operations, even the ones that are in difficulty at the moment, they tend to have at least ameliorated the problem. What would have occurred before would have been all-out war in which hundreds of thousands or millions of people might have died. And the hope is that because that peacekeeping operation's on the ground, it's at least giving an opportunity to lessen the effects of the conflict and maybe create political space for the political leaders to negotiate continued compromises in the political process. So I think there've been there's a range of different countries in different regions of the world that have benefited. East Timor is another example, where the United Nations has been instrumental in helping states emerge from terrible civil wars. Angola and Mozambique were both fighting wars for 30 or 40 years during the Cold War. And at one point in the civil war in Angola, 1,000 people were dying every month. And because of the intervention, I think, by the United Nations with its peacekeeping operations, it really gave them an opportunity to transform into more stable democracies.
If I might interject here, wasn't there some charges of misbehavior by the troops in the Congo?
Yes, and that's the downside at times that we've seen is that peacekeeping, because of the way that it's organised, means that the Secretary General, when a new operation is created, the Secretary General has to write and request volunteers from member states. And the tendency has been for member states from poorer places of the world, in which perhaps the troops aren't always as well trained and prepared as the UN would like, are deployed in these situations, and the UN, I think, is trying to do as much as it can to deal with situations. In the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of them, in the Central African Republic is another, where troops from some contingents are being accused of sexual crimes against minors. And of course, you have to, the responsibility is on the state from which they came to prosecute them for any of those crimes, and to work as best they can to ensure that the troops have the discipline not to involve themselves in criminal activities. So there can be a range of criminal activities. Sometimes it's sexual assault, other times it can be anything from selling weapons to selling fuel and other things. But that comes down to basically, I think, discipline and the threat of prosecution if they're caught.
Incidentally, you mentioned the Secretary General. Are they up for a new one?
They are. Actually, yes. We'll have our 9th Secretary General in January. And Ban Ki-moon is just coming up to the end of his 2nd term. And each term is 5 years. And the big news this year, I think, is that of the 8 candidates that are up for the job, 4 of them are women. So there's a good chance that the United Nations may have its first female Secretary General. This, in and of itself, this is big news, because up until the last year or two, the decision about who would be the next Secretary General was made behind closed doors. So the Permanent 5 would meet, particularly I think the US and Russia, and they would decide who they thought was the best candidate, and then they would forward that through the Security Council to the General Assembly, who then vote on it. but there's been a big push to make the election more transparent. So rather than having it decided behind closed doors, at least in this case, all 8 candidates were nominated by the Security Council of the General Assembly, and they even in April of this year had 2-hour hustings in which they were asked questions from the floor of the General Assembly. So at least we know who the candidates are.
Would we recognize the name of it?
None of the, I don't think any of the primary candidates, many of them have worked within the United Nations. The region, there's a kind of an informal agreement as to the rotation of regions that will take up the position, and Eastern Europe is heavily represented in this case. So there are representatives from countries like Bulgaria and Moldova and Croatia and others. So there's there are no famous names, globally famous names, I think, but many with long records of careers within the United Nations and other foreign ministry, foreign ministers of countries and former presidents too. So it certainly changed the nature of the process, I think, because it's brought out into the open how the process takes place. And interestingly enough, as many people have said when in discussing this, that if the Secretary General of the United Nations is a female, and then there's the US presidential election, and there's a chance for the first female president, and then in Britain at the moment there's a process going on to choose a new prime minister, and Theresa May is the principal candidate in that. So it is possible anyway that by January we might find the United Nations, the United States, Great Britain, and Germany with Angela Merkel all led by women. So that's a large part, I think, in with the UN Secretary General being a female. It's a large part in trying to meet the goals of diversity and inclusivity that the UN has set for itself too.
Well, earlier you mentioned some good things that the UN has done, but it doesn't seem to affect the public here. They don't give it much or not a lot of praise. I noticed the Gallup poll asked people to judge what kind of job they think the UN is doing, and in February of this year, 54% of those polled said poor. In February 2007, 66% said poor. Why this criticism?
I think it's a shame, and I think a lot of it comes down to the bad publicity that the United Nations gets. I can understand a lot of it because with a 24-hour news cycle, most people are getting news of conflicts emerging and terrorism and refugees, hundreds of thousands and millions of refugees, and you may get the impression that the United Nations wasn't doing anything or everything is falling apart, and it's easy to blame a distant international institution in which you don't feel any real connection and certainly no perhaps democratic accountability with. So we've seen it in Europe at the moment, with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. There seems to be in some ways perhaps a sense of distrust with politicians and political authorities and institutions, but I think the United Nations has always suffered from a lack of understanding of what it actually does and where it spends most of its time and its money. The focus is always on the Security Council, and then the focus tends to be on when the Security Council is deadlocked, because when things are going well, it tends not to get the attention, and when peace is established, it tends not to get attention. The attention goes where the conflict is starting, and then automatically you get the impression, there's another example where the United Nations hasn't been able to stop the conflict. So I think it's just unfortunately a lot of the news cycle, a lack of understanding, a lack of information. But the UN does a much better job than it used to when I first started studying it 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I used to have to travel to the UN library in London to have to photocopy documents to get information. Now I tell my students all you have to do is go to the UN website and you can click on any of the information that I used to have to spend a day trying to gather. So there's a lot of information about what the UN is doing on its website, and I think that would be the kind of place that people should go to get a really holistic view of what the UN is doing in terms of peace and security and development.
Well, there's a big example right now, the war going on in Syria. And how can the UN do something good about that?
Well, it's a very complex and difficult issue, and I think the UN isn't a panacea in the sense that there's no magic dust that you can sprinkle on international politics to make everything rosy and make everybody agree. The United Nations, I think most people would say, if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because we have to have some forum in which the great powers can come together to discuss their differences. So if we agreed all the time, we wouldn't need the United Nations Security Council. Everything would just take care of itself. But that's not the way life is, and that's not the way international politics is. So I think the Security Council and the United Nations itself creates a forum in which these states can come together, their differences, and at least try to compromise at times, knowing that compromise is an essential part of achieving peace in this situation. Of course, when you have diametrically opposed viewpoints on, for example, should Assad stay in power, and you have one permanent member of the Security Council in favour of staying and one against, then of course you get deadlock, and then what happens is the United Nations is still heavily involved, but they're heavily involved in trying to deal with the effects of the conflict. So we have 5 million refugees in neighbouring countries. We have a couple of million or more displaced internally, and hundreds of thousands of refugees trying to make it across Europe. And the UN High Commission for Refugees and the UN Development Programme are involved in those processes, trying to, I think, collect about 8 billion for development next year. So they're heavily involved in all of those processes, but it's basically how do we try to manage the situation so that it doesn't get any worse, it doesn't affect neighbouring countries to the point where, and that's the danger, of course, that we have this, the infection from one country to another when you have destabilization, that refugees moving into neighbouring countries can destabilize those countries too. So the UN is heavily involved in trying to deal with the refugee crisis and development issues, of course, as hopefully Syria will emerge from the conflict. But of course, you don't really see that on the news. Nobody, it's you don't. It's not the first thing that will be covered by the news reporters, understandably, because they're interested in the high politics. But so the UN is still, I think, instrumentally involved in dealing with it, even though we may not always see it.
Well, yes, you were alluding to Assad,
yes,
getting Russian support,
yes,
and the
yes,
United States opposition to them.
Yes, and I think that's, it's going to come down to, and it has been the problem, I think, since 2011, since it started, that the United States has the goal of deposing Assad. Saudi Arabia has the same goal, and Iran and Russia have the interest of keeping him in power. And unfortunately, the Syrian people have been caught in the crossfire. And at some point, there's going to have to be an agreement on how to overcome those differences, but it's a very difficult, very complex problem, and the United Nations I think is a forum. It also has its peace envoy, of course, who tries to engender peace by hopefully through its diplomacy working towards developing peace agreements. But so much, and I think we can talk about other cases too. So much of the peace that's created depends on the people who are in power. The willingness to compromise or even to leave office after they've been elected. We're looking at a couple of places in Africa at the moment, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi, in which peace agreements were signed, peacekeeping operations have been deployed or involved in those situations, and then eventually the person who's been elected serves their 2 terms and then refuses to leave office. And then very quickly it can spiral back into conflict. And of course, with Syria and Assad and wanting to stay in power, we see the same issue. And the problem at the end of the day, I think, is that the United Nations can do all it can to create the conditions under which peace can sprout. But if you don't have those people in power, like the George Washington, who's willing to leave office when some may clamour for them to stay, then the country can't evolve democratically, and then it's always in a cycle of conflict that it can't escape from. And I think that's what we're seeing in Burundi, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we can see, of course, the problem in Syria is a similar problem.
An Associated Press story on the 5th of July told how the UN is trying to get some food to 4 cities in the country, and it's having very much trouble with that. But without food, residents will die. Some are dying already. But how do they get in?
Yeah, and that's the horror of it, isn't it? In terms of, and that's where I think the agreements in the Security Council can make a significant impact in terms of ensuring that that UN convoys aren't attacked. That of course the food aid is allowed into those cities, but it's very easy, of course, to miss the severity of the conflict, the horrible severity of it in terms of what's happening to people on the ground in those cities, and because they're being caught in the midst of a war, they're essentially it's siege warfare, which is illegal in international law, and so we know it's the wrong thing to do. But we've kind of lived with this all the way back. I remember in Yugoslavia, in the Yugoslav civil wars back in the 1990s, we had a similar situation, especially with the Serb forces laying siege to mainly Muslim-dominated areas, Bosnian Muslim-dominated cities, and it's very hard to break unless you're willing to go in with enough forces in order to break the siege. And of course, if you're in a situation like Syria, in which it's so delicate, you can't simply deploy the number of forces that you would like in those situations, because a country like Russia is going to veto it on the Security Council. Then you end up, the UN ends up trying to have to make the best of a bad situation and trying to to convince the local actors and the governments to allow them to have access.
Going in, what kind of a force would the UN have? How big an army and equipment?
No. Well, the UN has no army. It has no police force in that respect. Peacekeeping operations are all created, as we said, with volunteers that are donated for a period of time. But what the UN Security Council can do is mandate a force to go in.
What kind?
It can mandate the UN Security Council. Mandate. So it can mandate the force. So in a situation in which you're concerned, you're looking in a situation to end a siege. For example, in Yugoslavia, the force was a NATO force that went in eventually to deal with it. Unfortunately, that was after a number of years of realizing that UN peacekeeping forces aren't the kind of forces you want to use for that kind of operation, because they don't have the capacity to fight in combat situations, and they can't end the sieges of cities like that. But in this case, you can't get a mandate, and that's the problem with the Syrian case. You can't get a mandate because there's no agreement between the major powers on the Security Council over what should be done. So it's at least in other cases, you might get a Security Council mandate. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in 2013, the South African Defense Community deployed a 3,000 strong intervention brigade, which went to war essentially with the M23 rebels in eastern Congo. So the decision was made that these M23 rebels were preventing peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that there was no way of including them in any future peace agreement, that they needed to be eradicated from the political situation. So they deployed 3,000 troops in order to defeat them. But it wasn't a UN, it was under the UN operation technically, but it was conducted by South African Defense Community forces. So those kind of operations, if you can get the agreement, then the UN Security Council will tend to mandate an organization, either the African Union or the South African Defense Community or NATO, and they can go in and use force if necessary. But you have to have, like you say, you have to have consensus on the Security Council, otherwise they'll use one of them will use a veto, and that action won't take place.
Could any other related groups do something, like the International Court of Justice? Could it get into this fight?
Well, I don't think so. In terms of the International Court of Justice is a court that really works on states voluntarily bringing their case before it. So it's a wonderful way for states to try to resolve their conflicts peacefully. When the United Nations was formed, the idea was that not only would it protect the sovereignty of states so that we would prevent the next war, but it would also provide numerous ways in which states might negotiate their problems. They might discuss their problems and mediate and negotiate rather than go to war. One of those ways was the International Court of Justice. So you can bring your cases before it, hopefully establishing a body of law that will help in future cases. I think maybe if you're thinking in terms of a court that may have an effect in these situations, it's not a UN court, but the International Criminal Court that is based in The Hague. Is a court, I think, that is increasingly having an effect on what's happening in civil wars and the thinking that goes on with warlords and others who are involved, because they're concerned that they may eventually end up being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for what we're talking about: crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. Interestingly, in the case of South Sudan, there was the president and vice president of South Sudan, which has just emerged from a couple of years of civil war. So it emerged from the peace process with North Sudan, gained its independence in 2011, and then ended up in civil war again. But the two leaders of the opposition parties in the fight wrote a letter arguing that the International Criminal Court should not prosecute in their case, but they should have a truth commission. And similarly, in a similar case to South Africa, they had a truth commission after apartheid. Northern Ireland had a truth commission after the troubles there ended in '97. And the reason that they want a truth commission, of course, is that truth commissions give immunity. So if you come before the truth commission, tell the truth about your actions and what you've witnessed, then you get immunity from prosecution. So I think that shows a mentality that here are two leaders. In the case of South Sudan, they've gained their independence as a country. They're the leaders of the country, but they're essentially writing letters, op-ed pieces in Western newspapers, essentially pleading for a truth commission rather than ICC prosecutions. And if that's the case, I think you can tell that the sense of accountability is percolating globally, and it's obviously going to have an impact on the decision making of those who might have thought they would get away with these crimes in the past.
Alas, our time is up.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
My thanks to UW Eau Claire Professor of Political Science, Stephen Hill, for your knowledge of the U.S. We may have to meet again.
Wonderful, thank you. I appreciate it.
From the Newsroom is a production of the Western Wisconsin Press Club in cooperation with Community TV. Thanks for watching. I'm Henry Lippold.